The rain was relentless that night, hammering against my apartment window like it was trying to break through and drown me. I sat there, curled up on my couch, clutching a glass of wine I hadn't even sipped. My phone was face down on the coffee table, silent but screaming with the weight of what had just happened. 8 hours earlier, I'd walked out of my office for the last time, my heels clicking on the polished marble floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Tired, the word felt like a blade slicing through everything I'd built. But it wasn't just losing my job that had me spiraling, it was why I refused to sleep with my boss. And now, I was paying the price. You ever have one of those moments where the world slows down and you see every detail with sickening clarity? That was me, standing in his office that morning. The air was thick with his cologne, the kind that costs more than my rent. He leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes glinting like he already owned me. "You're smart, talented," he'd said, his voice smooth as venom, "but you could be so much more if you played the game." His hand brushed mine as he slid a contract across the desk, a promotion, a corner office, a salary that could have changed my life. All I had to do was say yes, not to the job, to him. I can still feel the way my stomach twisted, the way my skin crawled under his gaze. I'd worked hard to get there, a night spent hunched over spreadsheets, weekends sacrificed to perfect presentations, years of proving I was more than just a pretty face in a skirt. And in that moment, it all came crashing down. I pushed the contract back, my voice steady even though my insides were screaming. "I'm not that kind of person," I told him. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned cold, like I'd just signed my own death warrant. "You'll regret this," he said, so casually it chilled me to the bone. By noon, I was called into HR. Misconduct, they said. Insubordination. A vague list of accusations that didn't even make sense. My desk was already cleared out by the time I got back my framed photo of my dog, my favorite coffee mug, all stuffed into a cardboard box like I was some kind of criminal. Security escorted me to the elevator, their hands hovering near my elbows as if I might make a scene. I didn't. I held my head high, even as tears burned behind my eyes. But inside, I was shattering. You know what's worse than losing your job? Losing your sense of safety. I'd always thought I was untouchable, smart, driven, good at what I did. I'd climbed the corporate ladder faster than most, earned respect from colleagues, even landed a few industry awards. But none of that mattered when he decided I was disposable. I kept replaying it, wondering if I'd misread the signs. Had he always been like this? The late-night texts about urgent projects, a lingering looks during meetings, a friendly dinners he insisted I attend. I brushed it off as ambition, as networking. Now, I saw it for what it was, a trap. That night, as the rain kept falling, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just anger, though God knows I was furious. It was something deeper, heavier, like a storm brewing in my chest. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. I couldn't. But how do you fight back when the person who ruined you holds all the power? He wasn't just my boss, was a titan in our industry, the kind of man who could make or break careers with a phone call. I'd seen him do it before, smiling as he blacklisted a rival or crushed a startup that dared compete. If I came for him, I'd have to be smarter. I'd have to be ruthless. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I paced my apartment, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. My mind was racing, piecing together every interaction, every email, every moment I'd spent in that office. There had to be something, some leverage, some crack in his armor. I thought about the other women in the company, the ones who'd left suddenly, their faces replaced by new hires before anyone could ask questions. Had they faced the same choice? Had they paid the same price? The thought made my blood run cold, but it also lit a fire in me. If I wasn't the only one, maybe I wasn't as alone as I felt. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to roll over and disappear. I wasn't going to let him win. But I also knew I couldn't storm back into that office with nothing but my pride. I needed a plan. Something calculated, something he wouldn't see coming. Revenge isn't always loud, you know. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, like a shadow moving just out of sight. I poured myself a coffee, my hands shaking not from fear but from purpose. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of grief and grit. I'd wake up each morning with this hollow ache in my chest, like someone had carved out a piece of me. Losing my job wasn't just about money that, trust me, my bank account was screaming. It was about identity. For years, I defined myself by my work. I was the woman who closed deals, who turned failing projects into successes, who walked into boardrooms and commanded attention. Now, I was an employee, untethered and, worst of all, humiliated. I didn't tell anyone at first, not my friends, not my family. How do you explain something like this? Hey, I got fired because I wouldn't sleep with my creep of a boss. It sounded like something out of a bad movie. Not my life. I was too ashamed, too raw. Instead, I spent hours scrolling through job boards, my laptop balanced on my knees as I sat on the floor, surrounded by half-eaten takeout containers. Every listing felt like a punch to the gut. My resume was stellar, glowing references, measurable achievements, a degree from a top university. But his shadow loomed over it all. One call from him, one whisper to the right person, and I'd be untouchable. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way my phone stayed to quiet, no follow-ups from recruiters, no replies to applications. I'd always been headhunted, my inbox full of offers. Now, it was a ghost town. I reached out to a few old colleagues, casually asking if they'd heard of any openings. Most didn't respond. The ones who did were vague, distant, like they were afraid to get too close. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just done with me. He was erasing me. I could have given up. Honestly, part of me wanted to. I'd lie in bed some nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made the wrong choice. Maybe I should have played along, taken the promotion, kept my head down. Other women did it, didn't they? Survived, thrived even, by navigating men like him. But every time I thought about it, I saw his face, that smug certainty that I'd have, and I knew I'd rather burn it all down than let him touch me. One evening, I was at a coffee shop, trying to feel human again. The barista was chatty, asking why I looked so stressed. I laughed it off, but something about her kindness broke me open. I started talking, not the whole story, just pieces. How I'd lost my job, how it felt like the ground had vanished beneath me. She listened, her eyes soft but fierce, and when I finished, she slid a free latte across the counter. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "Don't let them take that from you." Her words stuck with me, like a lifeline I didn't know I needed. I went home and pulled out my laptop, but this time, I wasn't looking for jobs. I started digging, not into him, not yet, that would come later, into myself. What did I have that he couldn't touch? I'd always been good at finding patterns, connecting dots others missed. It's what made me great at my job. If I could analyze markets and predict trends, I could analyze him. I could find a way to hit back. I started small, combing through my own records, mails, meeting notes, anything I'd kept from my time at the company. Most of it was routine, but there were fragments that felt off. A project I'd been pulled from at the last minute, a client reassigned without explanation. I remembered how he'd framed it as protecting my workload, but now I wondered, was he testing me even then? Seeing how far he could push? I saved everything, organizing it like I was building a case. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time since that awful day, I felt a spark of control. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't broken. I was angry. Yes, but anger can be fuel if you know how to use it. I closed my laptop and looked out at the city skyline, the lights blurring through my window. He thought he'd buried me. He had no idea what was coming. The city felt different now, like it was watching me. Every corner I turned, every face I passed, I wondered if they knew, if they'd heard, if he'd already spread his version of the story, painting me as unstable, incompetent, anything but the truth. I'd catch myself checking my reflection in shop windows, adjusting my posture, trying to look like the woman I used to be. But inside, I was a tangle of nerves and determination, walking a tightrope between despair and defiance. I'd started carrying a notebook everywhere, jotting down thoughts as they came. It wasn't organized, just scraps of ideas, memories, questions, things I'd overheard in the office, names of people who'd left under strange circumstances, dates that didn't add up. I didn't know what I was looking for. Not exactly. But I trusted my instincts. I'd spent years honing them, learning to read between the lines of contracts and corporate doublespeak. If there was something to find, I'd find it. One afternoon, I was at the library, tucked into a corner with my laptop and a stack of old industry reports. I wasn't even sure why I was there, mate. I just needed to feel productive, to escape the suffocating quiet of my apartment. I was skimming an article about a merger my company had handled a couple of years back, one I'd worked on peripherally. It was a big deal at the time, splashed across every business outlet, with my boss taking all the credit. I remembered how he'd stood at the podium during a press conference, his smile wide enough to charm the devil himself. Something about the article caught my eye, mention of a whistleblower who tried to flag irregularities in the deal. The story was buried, barely a paragraph, and a whistleblower's name wasn't even mentioned. I dug deeper, pulling up archived forums, obscure blogs, anything I could find. Most of it was dead ends. But one post on a now-defunct message board mentioned a woman who'd worked on the merger, someone who'd left the company shortly after. No details, just a first name. Sarah. I froze, my coffee going cold in my hand. Sarah. I knew as Sarah. Or I had. She'd been a senior analyst, sharp as a tack, always the first to spot a flaw in a plan. We weren't close, but we'd grabbed drinks a few times, bonded over the chaos of deadlines. Then one day, she was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty desk and a rumor she'd moved on. I tried calling her once, but her number was disconnected. At the time, I didn't think much of it. People burn out, right? But now, sitting in that library, I felt the chill. I spent the next few hours chasing leads, but Sarah was a ghost. No LinkedIn, no social media, nothing. It was like she'd vanished. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. Was I grasping at straws? Maybe, but my gut told me there was more to her story, just like there was more to mine. I wrote her name in my notebook, circling it twice. If I could find her, maybe she'd have answers. Maybe she'd be a piece of the puzzle. Life didn't stop while I played detective. Bills piled up, my savings dwindled, and the silence from recruiters was deafening. I took a part-time gig at a bookstore to keep the lights on, shelving novels and ringing up customers with a smile I didn't feel. It was humbling. In a way, nobody cared about my fancy degree or my corner office dreams. But it also grounded me. The other employees were kind, real, unpretentious. They'd share stories over lunch breaks, laughing about bad dates or family drama. I didn't talk much, but I listened. And slowly, I started to feel less alone. One night, after a long shift, I went for a walk to clear my head. The streets were alive with nose-honking cabs, chattering crowds, music spilling from bars. I ended up at a park, sitting on a bench under a flickering street lamp. I pulled out my notebook, flipping through pages of scribbled theories. That's when I saw a woman across the street, hurrying past with her head down. Something about her walk, the way she clutched her bag, felt familiar. I squinted, my heart racing. Sarah. I stood, ready to call out, but she was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was close to something. The next day, I went back to the library, this time searching for anything tied to the merger. I found a cashed legal document, a settlement agreement buried in a public records database. It was heavily redacted, but one line stood out. A non-disclosure agreement signed by an unnamed employee. The date matched Sarah's departure. My pulse quickened. Enders weren't uncommon. But this felt different. Why would someone like Sarah, a mid-level analyst, need to be silenced? I didn't have proof. Not yet. But I was starting to see a pattern: people who got too close to the truth, who asked too many questions, didn't last long. I thought about my own firing. How neatly it had been packaged as misconduct. Was that his playbook? Crush anyone who wouldn't bend. I started reaching out to others. Carefully. Former colleagues, industry contacts, even a professor from my grad school days who'd always liked me. I didn't mention him directly, just asked fake questions about the company, the merger, anything that might jog a memory. Most people were cagey, but a few dropped hints. A missed promotion here. A strange reassignment there. Nothing concrete, but enough to keep me going. I was building something, even if I couldn't see the whole picture yet. The bookstore job gave me unexpected allies. One of my co-workers, a guy named Leo, was a tech nerd, always tinkering with code on his breaks. I didn't tell him everything, but I mentioned I was researching an old company scandal. He offered to help, showing me how to use search tools I'd never heard of, ways to dig into deleted posts or hidden files. I hesitated at first. Did I really want to pull someone else into this? But Leo was persistent, and I was desperate. We started meeting after work, hunched over his laptop in a diner, chasing digital breadcrumbs. It wasn't all progress. Some days, I'd hit a wall and feel like I was losing my mind. I'd dream about the office, about his voice echoing in my ears, telling me I'd never be enough. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat. But then I'd see my notebook, my messy handwriting filling page after page, and I'd remember why I was doing this. Not just for me, for Sarah, for anyone else he'd hurt. One evening, Leo texted me a link. Found something weird, he wrote. I clicked it, my hands trembling. It was an old email chain, recovered from a hacked server that had been part of a data leak years ago. The emails were between my boss and someone I didn't recognize, discussing cleaning up the merger. The language was vague, but one phrase stood out. She's asking too many questions, no names. But the timing lined up with Sarah's exit. I stared at the screen, my breath shallow. This was it, proof he wasn't untouchable. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I felt a weight settle over me. Finding evidence was one thing, seeing it was another. He had money, lawyers, connections. I had a part-time job and a hunch. But I also had something he didn't. Time. He thought I was gone, out of the picture. That was his mistake. I saved the email, backed it up in 3 places, and closed my laptop. The city hummed outside my window, oblivious to the war I was waging. I wasn't ready to strike yet, but I was getting closer. And when I did, he'd never see it coming. The air in my apartment felt heavier now, like it was holding its breath. I'd stopped noticing the little things: way the radiator hissed, the faint buzz of the fridge. My world had narrowed to my laptop, my notebook, and the growing pile of evidence I was piecing together. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore, or even me. It was about him, about the system that let him thrive, about every door he'd slammed shut on people who dared to say no. I was careful, obsessive even. Every file was encrypted, every search done through VPN Leo had set up. He'd become more than a co-worker, now a friend, maybe the only one I trusted. We'd spend hours at that diner, our voices low, dissecting what we'd found. The email chain was a start, but it wasn't enough. It hinted at wrongdoing, sure, but it was too vague to nail him. We needed more, something undeniable, something that would stick. I started thinking about the merger again, that glittering deal he'd built his reputation on. If there was dirt, it was buried there. I remembered how secretive he'd been during it, How he'd locked himself in his office for days, barking orders through the door. At the time, I thought it was stress. Now, I wondered what he was hiding. I tracked down old financial statements, cross-referencing them with public records. Numbers don't lie, but they can be dressed up to look prettier than they are. And these numbers, they were wearing a full face of makeup. There were discrepancies small at first, easy to miss if you weren't looking. Payments to vendors that didn't exist. Expenses logged under vague categories like consulting. I wasn't an accountant, but I'd seen enough budgets to know when something smelled rotten. I showed Leo, and he dug into the vendors, tracing their registrations. Shell companies, he said, set up to funnel money and then dissolve. It wasn't proof of a crime. Not yet. But it was a thread to pull. Pulling threads is dangerous though. I started feeling if paranoia creeping in. I'd check my locks twice before bed, glance over my shoulder on the street. Once, I thought I saw a car idling outside my building, its headlights cutting through the dark. I told myself I was imagining things. But the fear was real. He wasn't just a man. He was a machine, with tentacles reaching into places I couldn't see. If he knew what I was doing, I wouldn't just lose a job. I could lose everything. I kept going anyway. What else could I do? Giving up would mean letting him win, letting him keep his throne while I faded into nothing. I thought about my old life sometimes. The one where I'd stride into meetings with a coffee in hand, my calendar packed with purpose. That woman felt like a stranger now. But I wanted to be her again at the same. Not naive, but strong, unbreakable. One night, Leo called me, his voice tight. He'd found something Elsia forum post from years ago, buried in an obscure corner of the internet. Someone claiming to be an ex-employee had written about the merger, saying they'd been forced out after raising concerns. The account was anonymous, but the details matched Sarah's story too closely to be a coincidence. They mentioned a file, a spreadsheet they'd kept as insurance. Then the post cut off, like they'd been scared into silence. A spreadsheet. My heart pounded. If it existed, it could be the key hard data tying him to the fraud. But where was it? Sarah was still a ghost, and the poster hadn't left a trail. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. What would I have done if I were her? If I'd had proof and nowhere to turn, I'd hide it. I decided, somewhere safe, somewhere he'd never look. The next day, I did something reckless. I went to the office building inside, just close enough to see the glass doors, the people streaming in and out. It was stupid, I know, but I needed to feel it again. At place where my life had unraveled. I stood across the street, my hood up, watching. That's when I saw her, not Sarah, but another woman I'd worked with, Emily. She'd been quiet, always keeping to herself, but kind. She was carrying a box, just like I had, her face pale as she hurried to a car. I followed her, not proud of it, but I did. I kept my distance, blending into the crowd until she reached a coffee shop a few blocks away. She sat by the window, staring at nothing, her hands wrapped around a mug. I slid into the seat across from her before I could talk myself out of it. Her eyes widened, but she didn't run. What happened? I asked, keeping my voice soft. She didn't want to talk, not at first, but I pressed just enough. And then it spilled out. The same story. An offer she couldn't accept, a job she couldn't keep. Emily didn't know much, but she knew Sarah. They'd been friends, she said, until Sarah left. She didn't have details, just a memory of Sarah saying she'd kept everything in case she needed it. I asked what that meant, but Emily shook her head, tears in her eyes. She was scared, she whispered. We all were. I left the coffee shop with more questions than answers, but also with a name. Not Sarah's full name, but the last initial she'd mentioned once, buried in a casual story about her family. It was enough to narrow my search. Leo and I spent days combing through records, cross-referencing everything we could. And then, finally, a small news article about a community event from years ago, mentioning a Sarah T. in a town a few hours away. I didn't tell Leo what I was doing. I didn't tell anyone. I rented a car and drove, my hands gripping the wheels so tight my knuckles ached. The town was quiet, all picket fences and fading storefronts. I found her address through a public directory, a little house with a sagging porch. I sat in my car for an hour, working up the nerve. What if she didn't want to talk? What if she didn't even remember me? When I knocked, the door opened slowly. It was her, older, tired, but Sarah. She stared at me, and for a moment, I thought she'd slam the door. But then she stepped aside, letting me in. The house smelled like lavender and dust, and we sat at her kitchen table, the silence stretching between us. I didn't push. I just told her my story, every ugly detail, and waited. She cried, not loud, just a quiet unraveling, like she'd been holding it in for years. And then she talked about the merger, the lies, the threats, about the spreadsheet she'd copied before she left, tucked away on a drive she'd hidden. She hadn't used it to afraid, to broken, but she still had it. She pulled it out, a tiny USB stick, and handed it to me like it was burning her. I drove home in a daze, the USB in my pocket. When I opened it, I saw what she'd seen: names, dates, transactions, proof he'd skimmed millions, proof he'd buried anyone who got in his way. It was everything I needed, and it terrified me, because now I had to decide what to do with it. I didn't sleep for days. I'd hold that drive in my hand, feeling its weight, knowing it could ruin him and me. I thought about going public, but who believed me? A disgraced employee with a grudge. I thought about the law, but his lawyers would bury me in paperwork. And then I thought about something else, something quieter, something he'd never expect. I started small, leaking bits of the truth, anonymous posts on industry boards, just enough to stir whispers. I watched them spread, watched his name start to surface in ways he couldn't control. I wasn't done, not by a long shot, but I was moving, step by careful step, toward a reckoning. He'd taken my life apart. Now I was taking his. And the best part? He didn't even know it was me.